The year is 1847. The state is Georgia. And the world, for all its grandeur and terror, revolves around a single, sprawling estate known as Magnolia Grove. From the road, it was a vision of Southern aristocracy. A grand Greek revival mansion, its white columns gleaming in the relentless sun, stood sentinel over a sea of green. Ancient oaks, their limbs heavy with Spanish moss, formed a natural cathedral over the long, gravel drive. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the rich, loamy perfume of the earth, a deceptive sweetness that masked the rot beneath. At the heart of this gilded cage sat its mistress, Eleanor Winthrop. To the outside world, she was the very picture of a Southern belle grown into a formidable matriarch. Her hair, a severe silver blonde, was always coiled in a perfect chignon. Her dresses, though of the finest Parisian silk, were cut in a style that was both severe and elegant, a uniform of control. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. They were eyes that had seen too much and felt too little, or so the slaves whispered among themselves. Eleanor was a widow. Her husband, Charles Winthrop, a man whose fortune was built on cotton and the backs of the enslaved, had succumbed to a fever 3 years prior. In his will, he had left Magnolia Grove and its vast holdings to his wife, a decision that had raised more than a few eyebrows in the county. A woman managing such an enterprise? It was unheard of. But Eleanor, with a cold, calculating intelligence that belied her gender, had proven them all wrong. The plantation's profits had not only held steady, they had grown. Her success, however, was a source of deep, gnawing anxiety for the men of her own household, her 2 sons, Julian and Silas. Julian, the elder at 28, was the spitting image of his late father. He possessed the same broad shoulders, the same easy charm that could turn to a cruel sneer in an instant. He was a man of action, of the hunt and the horse, who believed his birthright entitled him to rule over Magnolia Grove. He saw his mother's continued control as a personal insult, a denial of his masculine authority. He chafed under her thumb, his resentment a slow-burning fuse. Silas, 2 years his junior, was a different creature entirely. Where Julian was fire, Silas was ice. He was quieter, more introspective, with a scholar's mind that he had honed at a northern university before his father's death had called him home. He was handsome in a more refined way, with his mother's sharp features and a gaze that seemed to look through a person rather than at them. He was less overtly rebellious than his brother, but his silence was its own kind of weapon. He watched, he listened, and he stored away every slight, every command, every cold glance from his mother. The tension in the big house was a living thing, a third, invisible occupant that slithered through the halls and coiled around the dinner table. Eleanor was acutely aware of it. She knew her sons saw her as an obstacle, a temporary regent until they could claim their inheritance. But she had no intention of relinquishing her power. Magnolia Grove was her creation, her masterpiece. She had built its wealth not just on cotton, but on a far more insidious and profitable enterprise, one that required a level of control and secrecy that only she could manage. Her domain extended far beyond the manicured lawns and the grand parlor. It stretched into the quarters, a collection of rough-hewn cabins set a respectful distance from the main house, where the enslaved people of Magnolia Grove lived. To Eleanor, they were not people. They were assets, units of labor, and, in her most private and ambitious thoughts, they were a breeding stock. The domestic slave trade was booming. The invention of the cotton gin had created an insatiable demand for strong, healthy field hands in the Deep South. A prime male slave could fetch $1,000 or more at auction in New Orleans. But there was a problem. The supply was not keeping up with the demand. The international slave trade had been outlawed, and the natural increase of the enslaved population was, in Eleanor's view, far too slow and inefficient. She had a solution, a radical, horrifying solution that she had been perfecting for years. She would not wait for nature. She would engineer it. Her breeding program was her most prized secret. She had selected her stock with the same meticulous care a thoroughbred breeder would use for horses. She looked for strong backs, broad hips, and, most importantly, a docile temperament. She separated the men and women into different quarters, controlling their interactions with an iron fist. She kept detailed ledgers, not of cotton yields, but of menstrual cycles, of couplings, of births, and infant mortality rates. She was a scientist of human misery. But there was a flaw in her system, a gap in her control that kept her awake at night. The men she used for breeding, the strongest, most virile field hands, were also the most dangerous. They were proud, they were strong, and they knew their worth. They resented their role as stud animals. There had been whispers of rebellion, of a man named Isaac who had dared to look at one of the women she had designated for another. Isaac had disappeared the next day. His fate was a lesson to them all. Eleanor needed a new kind of stud, one who was utterly loyal, who would follow her commands without question, whose seed she could trust to produce the strong, compliant offspring she desired. She needed someone whose loyalty was absolute, whose will was an extension of her own. She looked at her sons. The thought, when it first slithered into her mind, was so monstrous, so blasphemous, that she nearly recoiled from it. But then she considered it. Julian was strong, healthy, and virile. His Winthrop blood was pure, a guarantee of strong offspring. And his loyalty, while strained, was ultimately to the family name, to Magnolia Grove. He would do his duty, even if he didn't understand it. Silas was more of a question. He was intelligent, but his mind was a mystery to her. Would he submit to such a task? Or would his northern education and his quiet, watchful nature make him a liability? The idea took root, growing in the dark soil of her ambition. It was a solution of terrifying elegance. Her own sons, the heirs to Magnolia Grove, would be the sires of her next generation of slaves. Their blood, the blood of the master class, would be mixed with that of the enslaved, creating a new breed, a stronger, more valuable, and, she believed, more controllable stock. The offspring would be a living testament to her power, a fusion of the ruling class and the ruled, forever bound to her will. It was a secret so profound, so perverse, that its discovery would not only destroy her, but would bring the entire edifice of Southern gentility crashing down. It was a secret she would protect with her life. And so, in the spring of 1847, Eleanor Winthrop set her plan in motion. She called her sons to the library, a room lined with books they never read and filled with the ghost of their father's authority. "Boys," she began, her voice as smooth and cold as polished marble, "it is time we discussed the future of Magnolia Grove." The library was a tomb of knowledge, its air thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax. Sunlight, filtered through heavy velvet drapes, fell in dusty shafts across the Persian rug. Julian stood by the cold fireplace, his arms crossed, a picture of impatient arrogance. Silas sat in a high-backed chair, his long fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Eleanor stood before them, a queen holding court. She let the silence stretch, a tactic she had perfected to make men squirm. She wanted them off balance, their defenses down. "The plantation is thriving," she stated, her voice devoid of warmth. "Our cotton yields are the highest in the county. Our profits are secure. But security is a fragile thing, Julian. It can be shattered by a single season of bad weather, a drop in the market, or a lack of labor." Julian scoffed. "We have plenty of hands, Mother. More than enough." "Do we?" she countered, her winter blue eyes fixing on him. "The demand in the West is insatiable. Our current stock is aging. We need new blood. Strong, healthy blood. We can buy more," Silas offered quietly, his voice a low murmur. "There's a good auction in Savannah next month." Eleanor's lips thinned into a line of disapproval. "Buying is a fool's game, Silas. You pay a premium for a man whose history you don't know. He could be diseased, or rebellious, or weak. No, the only way to ensure quality is to produce it yourself." She let the implication hang in the air. Julian's brow furrowed. "Produce it? You mean breed them?" "Precisely," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I have a breeding program, a successful one, but it has its limitations. The men I have been using, they are strong, but they are also proud. They have their own wills. I need a sire whose loyalty is beyond question, a sire whose seed is of the highest quality." She paused, letting her gaze drift from one son to the other. She saw the dawning horror in Silas's eyes, the slow, ugly comprehension in Julian's. He was beginning to understand. "Mother," Julian said, his voice tight with a mixture of disbelief and a strange, burgeoning pride. Are you suggesting? I am suggesting, Eleanor said, her voice now steel, that you, my sons, are the future of this plantation, not just as its masters, but as its progenitors. Your strength, your health, your Winthrop blood, it is the key to our continued prosperity. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Silas went pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. Julian, after a moment of stunned silence, let out a short, harsh laugh. You want us to lie with the slaves? He asked, a strange mix of revulsion and curiosity in his tone. I want you to fulfill your duty to this family. Eleanor corrected him, her voice sharp. It is not a matter of lust, Julian. It is a matter of business, of legacy. The children you sire will be strong. They will be valuable. They will be a living extension of the Winthrop name, even if they wear the badge of slavery. This is madness, Silas breathed, finally finding his voice. It's unnatural. It's a sin. A sin. Eleanor's laugh was brittle and cold. What is a sin, Silas? Is it a sin to ensure the survival of your family? Is it a sin to use the resources God has given you? The Bible itself speaks of a man's duty to be fruitful and multiply. I am merely applying that principle to our circumstances. She turned her full attention on him, her gaze a physical weight. You spent your time in the North, reading your books and listening to their abolitionist nonsense. You have forgotten what it means to be a Winthrop. You have forgotten the blood that runs in your veins. This is not a request, Silas. It is your duty, just as it is Julian's. She walked to her desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a small, leather-bound book. It was her ledger, the one that held the secrets of her breeding program. She didn't open it, but its presence was a threat. If you refuse, she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, you will find yourself disinherited. You will be cast out of this house, with nothing but the clothes on your back. And you, Silas, with your delicate sensibilities, will find the world outside Magnolia Grove to be a very harsh place indeed. The threat hung in the air, heavy and final. Julian, after a moment of internal struggle, squared his shoulders. The idea of his own bloodline, of his seed creating a new generation of slaves, appealed to his sense of ownership and power. It was a twisted form of immortality. He would be a god to these people, their creator and their master. I will do my duty, mother, he said, his voice rough. Eleanor's face softened into a semblance of a smile. Good. That is what I expected from my firstborn. Her eyes then fell on Silas. He was trembling, his face a mask of conflict. He looked from his mother to his brother, and then down at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. He knew he was trapped. To refuse was to be destroyed. To comply was to become a monster. He said nothing. He simply nodded, a single, jerky movement of his head. It was enough. Eleanor's smile widened. Excellent. Now, there are some details to be arranged. She began to lay out her plan with the cold efficiency of a general. She had already selected the women. 2 of them. They were young, in their late teens, chosen for their health, their beauty, and their perceived docility. One was named Clara, a girl with large, frightened eyes and skin the color of dark honey. The other was Eliza, who was quieter, more reserved, with a strength in her posture that Eleanor found intriguing. Julian would be paired with Clara, Silas with Eliza. The couplings would take place in a small, private cabin she had prepared on the far edge of the property, away from the main quarters. It was to be a secret, known only to the 4 of them and the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose loyalty was bought with a lifetime of service and a pension that depended on her silence. You will visit them twice a week, Eleanor instructed, her voice clinical. On Tuesdays and Fridays. You will be discreet. You will not form any attachments. They are not your wives, not your mistresses. They are broodmares. Treat them as such. Julian nodded, a predatory gleam in his eye. Silas closed his eyes, as if trying to shut out the world. The meeting was over. As they left the library, the brothers did not look at each other. A new, unspoken chasm had opened between them, filled with shame, resentment, and a terrible, shared secret. That night, in his room, Silas stared out at the moonlit fields. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just for his own soul, but for the soul of his family, for the very idea of humanity. He had been taught that a man's word was his bond, that honor was paramount. And now, His mother had asked him to violate the most fundamental laws of decency. He was to become a rapist, a breeder of human beings, all in the name of profit. He thought of Eliza. He had seen her in the yard a few days ago, hanging laundry. She had a quiet dignity about her, a stillness that spoke of an inner world he could not imagine. He was to violate that world. He was to use her body as a vessel for his mother's ambition. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He was a Winthrop, and the Winthrops did not cry. He wiped it away, his face hardening into a mask of grim resignation. He would do as he was told, but he would not forget. He would watch. He would remember. And one day, he swore to himself, he would find a way to make this right. The private cabin was a place of profound dread. It was small, clean, and utterly devoid of comfort. There was a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single chair. The air was stale, smelling of lye soap and something else, something metallic and sour that clung to the back of the throat. Clara was the first to be brought there. She was led by Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, whose face was a mask of practiced indifference. Clara's hands were bound in front of her with a soft cotton rope, not to hurt her, but to remind her of her place. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. Julian entered the cabin with a swagger, trying to project an air of confidence he did not entirely feel. The reality of the situation was different from the abstract idea his mother had presented. This was a real person trembling before him. But he pushed the thought away. She was property. She was a broodmare. His duty was clear. He dismissed Mrs. Gable with a curt nod. The door closed behind her, leaving him alone with Clara. The silence was deafening. He could hear her shallow, rapid breaths. "Get on the bed," he ordered, his voice rough. She didn't move. She just stared at him, her fear now mixed with a spark of defiance. He took a step towards her, his hand reaching out. "I said, get on the bed." She flinched but did not obey. In that moment, Julian's carefully constructed facade of duty crumbled, revealing the brute beneath. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, and yanked her towards the bed. She cried out, a small, broken sound, and he covered her mouth with his hand. "It's your job," he hissed into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Just lie there and take it. It'll be over soon." What followed was not an act of procreation. It was an act of violence, of conquest. Julian used her, his movements harsh and impersonal, his mind focused only on the task his mother had given him. When it was over, he rolled off her, his chest heaving, and stared at the ceiling. He felt a strange emptiness, a hollowness where he had expected to feel power. Clara lay on the bed, curled into a tight ball, her body shaking with silent sobs. She didn't look at him. She just stared at the wall, her eyes empty. Julian got up, straightened his clothes, and left the cabin without a word. He walked back to the big house, his boots crunching on the gravel, feeling a new kind of shame settle over him. He had expected to feel like a king, a creator. Instead, he felt like a thief. Silas's first visit was different, but no less terrible. He arrived at the cabin with a book in his hand, a volume of poetry by Keats. It was a foolish, desperate gesture, an attempt to cling to the man he thought he was. Eliza was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her hands were not bound. She held herself with a quiet dignity that made Silas feel even more ashamed. She looked at him, not with fear, but with a deep, weary sadness. He couldn't bring himself to order her. He just stood in the doorway, the book hanging uselessly at his side. I don't know how to do this," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. Eliza didn't say a word. She just stood up and walked to the bed. She lay down, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her body as still, waiting monument to her own violation. Silas approached her slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. He put the book on the nightstand. He reached out a hand to touch her shoulder, but pulled it back as if burned. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He knew his apology was meaningless. It wouldn't change what was about to happen. It wouldn't erase the crime. But he had to say it. He had to acknowledge the horror of it, if only to himself. His movements were gentle, almost reverent, a stark contrast to his brother's brutality. But it was still rape. The lack of violence did not make it any less a violation. He was using her body for his mother's purpose, and his own compliance made him just as guilty. Afterwards, he lay beside her for a long moment, staring at the same spot on the ceiling she had been looking at. He felt a connection to her in that moment, a shared burden of shame and despair. He got up and left, forgetting his book on the nightstand. He didn't look back. The weeks turned into months. The visits to the cabin became a grim routine, a twice-weekly descent into hell. Julian grew more comfortable in his role, his initial shame hardening into a cold, detached cruelty. He began to see Clara not as a person, but as a thing, a vessel for his seed. He would sometimes bring her small trinkets, a ribbon, a piece of candy, as if that could somehow absolve him of his sin. She would take them with the same empty eyes, her spirit slowly being extinguished. Silas, on the other hand, grew more tormented. His visits with Eliza became a strange, silent communion. He would bring her books, leaving them for her to read. He would sometimes just sit in the chair and talk to her, telling her about the stars, about the poetry he loved, about the world outside Magnolia Grove that he knew she would never see. She never responded, but he felt she was listening. He began to see her not as a broodmare, but as a person he was destroying. He started to watch his mother more closely. He noticed the way she would inspect the women in the yard, her eyes lingering on their stomachs, on their hips. He saw her speaking with the plantation doctor, a man named Pembroke, a nervous little man with greasy hair and a perpetual look of guilt on his face. Silas began to suspect that his mother's ambitions went beyond simple breeding. She was planning something else, something even more monstrous. One evening, he overheard a conversation between his mother and Dr. Pembroke in the garden. He was hidden in the shadow of a magnolia tree, his heart pounding. "The first one is showing," Pembroke was saying, his voice a nervous whisper. "Clara, she's about 3 months along." "Good," Eleanor replied, her voice calm and satisfied. "And the other?" "Eliza is harder to read," Pembroke said. "She's very closed off, but I believe she is also with child." "Excellent," Eleanor said. "Their health is paramount. I want you to monitor them closely. I have a special diet planned for them. High in protein, lots of milk." There was a pause. Then Pembroke asked the question that sent a chill down Silas's spine. "And the procedure? When will you be ready for that?" Eleanor's voice was low, almost a hiss. "Not yet. We must wait until the 5th month. The specimens must be viable. We cannot afford another failure." Silas's blood ran cold. Specimens? Procedure? What were they talking about? He had heard of slave owners performing medical experiments on their slaves, but this sounded different. This sounded deliberate, calculated. He slipped away from the garden, his mind racing. He had to find out what his mother was planning. He had to protect Eliza and Clara, if it was not already too late. His search led him to the plantation's old smokehouse, a building that had fallen into disuse years ago. He had a feeling, a terrible intuition, that this was where his mother kept her darkest secrets. One night, under the cover of a moonless sky, he crept to the smokehouse. The door was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. He managed to pick it with a hairpin he'd taken from his mother's dressing table. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and something else, something sharp and chemical. The room was lit by a single oil lamp on a workbench. And on that workbench, Silas's worst fears were confirmed. There were glass jars filled with a clear liquid, and floating in that liquid were things. Small, malformed human forms. Fetuses. Some were barely the size of a thumb. Others were more developed, their tiny faces frozen in silent screams. There were labels on the jars, written in his mother's precise hand. Specimen 1, Julian/Clara, 3 months. Failed. Specimen 2, Silas/Eliza, for months. Failed. He stumbled back, while rising in his throat. His mother wasn't just breeding slaves. She was experimenting on them, on their unborn children. She was trying to create something, and she was discarding the failures like so much trash. He heard a noise behind him. He turned, his heart in his throat. His mother stood in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. In her hand, she held a pistol. "I knew you would be weak," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "I knew your northern sentimentality would make you a liability." "Mother, what is this?" Silas choked out, gesturing to the jars. "This," she said, stepping into the room, "is the future. A future you are too blind, too soft, to understand. These are not children, Silas. They are prototypes. Experiments in human engineering. I am trying to isolate the traits that make a slave valuable: strength, obedience, resilience. I am trying to breed them out of weakness, out of that cursed independent spirit they all seem to have. She raised the pistol, pointing it at his chest. You have seen too much. You have a choice. You can continue to do your duty and forget what you have seen here, or you can join these specimens on the shelf. Silas looked from the gun to the jars, and then to his mother's cold, dead eyes. He knew she would not hesitate to pull the trigger. She had already proven she had no soul. I'll do my duty, he whispered, his voice hollow. Good, she said, lowering the gun. Now get out. And if you ever speak of this to anyone, I will not just kill you. I will make an example of Eliza that will haunt you for the rest of your miserable life. Silas fled the smokehouse. The image of those tiny, floating bodies burned into his mind. He had thought he was participating in a great evil. He now realized he had only been scratching the surface. His mother was not just a breeder of slaves. She was a monster. The summer of 1847 was a season of unbearable heat and growing dread. The air over Magnolia Grove was thick with humidity and the unspoken knowledge of the horrors being committed in its shadow. Clara's pregnancy progressed. She grew round and heavy, her face losing its youthful softness, replaced by a mask of weary resignation. Julian's visits to the cabin had stopped, replaced by a new, more sinister routine. Eleanor would have Clara brought to the big house twice a week to be examined by Dr. Pembroke. The examinations were conducted in a small, windowless room off the kitchen, and the sounds that came from it, Clara's muffled cries of pain, sent a chill through the entire household. Silas watched from a distance, powerless to intervene. He tried to speak to Eliza, to warn her, but she was kept under even tighter watch. His mother suspected his growing attachment to her, and she was taking no chances. Eliza's own pregnancy was a mystery. She showed no outward signs, and she remained as silent and closed off as ever. But Silas could see the change in her eyes. There was a new fear there, a terror that went beyond the daily horror of her existence. One night, he managed to slip a note to her, hidden in a book he left for her. It was a simple message: be strong. I will find a way. He didn't know if she received it, or if she even understood it, but he had to try. The crisis came in late August. Clara went into labor. It was a difficult birth, lasting for 2 days. The entire plantation was on edge, the slaves working in a tense silence, the white overseers watching their watches with nervous impatience. Finally, on the 3rd day, a cry was heard from the birthing room. But it was not the strong, healthy wail of a newborn. It was a weak, thin sound, more like the mewling of a kitten. Silas was in the library, pretending to read, when his mother entered. Her face was a storm of fury and disappointment. It's a girl, she spat. And she's weak, sickly, useless. She paced the room, her hands clenched into fists. All that time, all that effort, for a runt. Julian's seed is strong, but the stock was flawed. Clara is too soft. She has no backbone. She stopped pacing and fixed her gaze on Silas. Which is why Eliza is so important. She is strong. Her child will be strong. I can feel it. Silas's blood ran cold. What will you do with Clara's baby? Eleanor's smile was a thin, cruel line. Dr. Pembroke will take care of it. He has a buyer in Charleston who has an interest in unique specimens. A medical school, I believe. She was going to sell the infant. Not as a slave, but as a cadaver for dissection. Silas felt a wave of nausea. His niece, his own flesh and blood, was to be sold to be cut open by medical students. He had to act. He couldn't let this happen. But what could he do? He was trapped, watched, and powerless. That night, he made a decision. He would help Eliza escape. He would get her away from Magnolia Grove, away from his mother's monstrous plans. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but it was the only hope. He waited for a night with a full moon, a night when the overseers would be drunk on corn whiskey after a day of hard work. He stole a horse from the stables and met Eliza at the edge of the woods, behind the slave quarters. She was waiting for him, her face pale but determined. She was not showing, but Silas knew she was carrying his child. He helped her onto the horse, his heart pounding with fear and hope. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice the first he had heard from her in months. "North," he said, "to a free state. I have friends. I think we'll find a way." He climbed on behind her and urged the horse into a gallop, heading for the dark line of the forest. For a moment, he felt a surge of freedom, a belief that they could escape the nightmare of Magnolia Grove. But they had not gone a mile before the sound of barking dogs split the night air. And then, the sharp crack of a rifle. Eleanor had been watching. She had anticipated his betrayal. The horse reared, spooked by the gunshot. Silas lost his grip and fell to the ground. He looked up to see Eliza clinging to the saddle, her eyes wide with terror. "Go," he shouted. "Don't stop. Go." He scrambled to his feet, drawing the pistol he had stolen from his mother's desk. He fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare the dogs, to give Eliza a chance. He saw the lanterns of the overseers bobbing through the trees, heard their shouts. He knew he couldn't outrun them. His only hope was to draw them away from Eliza. He ran into the woods, firing his pistol blindly, creating a trail of noise and chaos. The dogs were on him in seconds, their teeth tearing at his clothes, his skin. He fought them off, his mind focused only on one thought: Eliza must get away. He was finally overwhelmed, dragged to the ground by the weight of the dogs and the overseers. He was beaten, his face a mask of blood, his body broken. When he was dragged back to Magnolia Grove, he found Eliza waiting for him in the yard. She had been caught. She had not gotten far. His mother stood on the porch, her face a mask of cold triumph. "You are a fool, Silas," she said, her voice ringing with contempt. "You thought you could defy me? You thought you could save her?" She walked down the steps and stood over him, her shadow falling across his broken body. "You have sealed her fate, and your own." She turned to the overseers. "Take him to the smokehouse. Chain him up. He will watch." She then turned to Eliza, her voice softening into a terrifying parody of kindness. "My dear, you have been through an ordeal. You must be exhausted. Mrs. Gable will take you to your room. You need your rest. For the baby's sake." Eliza looked at Silas, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to swallow the light. She didn't say a word. She just turned and followed Mrs. Gable into the house. Silas was dragged to the smokehouse, the same place where he had discovered his mother's horrific experiments. He was chained to the wall, his wounds left to fester. For days, he was given only water, his body growing weaker by the hour. He was there when Dr. Pembroke came for him. The doctor looked nervous, his hands trembling as he set up his instruments on the workbench. "Your mother, she wants a sample," Pembroke stammered, unable to meet Silas's eyes. "For her research." Silas knew what that meant. His mother wanted his blood, his tissue, maybe even a piece of his liver or kidney. She wanted to study him, to understand the weakness she saw in him, to see if it was something she could breed out of her future stock. He screamed as the doctor's knife bit into his flesh, the pain a white-hot agony that threatened to consume him. But through the pain, one thought remained clear: Eliza. He had to survive. He had to find a way to save her and her unborn child. The final act of the tragedy at Magnolia Grove began on a cold, gray morning in November. The first frost had kissed the ground, and the air held the sharp, clean scent of impending winter. Eleanor Winthrop was in her element. Eliza was in her 5th month of pregnancy, and according to Dr. Pembroke, the fetus was developing perfectly. Strong heartbeat. Good size. Eleanor was convinced this child would be the success she had been waiting for, the perfect fusion of Winthrop's strength and enslaved resilience. She had decided it was time for the procedure. Not the crude, external breeding she had been doing, but the internal, surgical manipulation that would guarantee the traits she desired. She had read about a new technique in a medical journal from Europe, a way to influence the development of the fetus in utero. It was risky, but she was willing to take the chance. She ordered Eliza to be brought to the smokehouse. Silas, who had been kept alive in his chains, his body a map of scars and infection, heard the order. He knew what it meant. This was his last chance. He had been planning his escape for weeks, conserving his strength, loosening the rusted manacle on his wrist with a piece of broken glass he'd hidden in the straw. When the overseers came to take him for his daily examination, he was ready. As they unlocked his chains, he lunged, using the broken glass to slash at the nearest man's throat. The man went down with a gurgle. Silas grabbed his pistol and fired at the second overseer, hitting him in the leg. He didn't stop to see if he was dead. He ran. He ran through the woods, his body screaming in protest, his mind focused on one goal: the smokehouse. He arrived just as Eliza was being led inside by 2 of his mother's most trusted men. Eleanor was already there, standing by the workbench, her surgical instruments laid out with chilling precision. "Stop!" Silas shouted, his voice raw from disuse. Everyone turned. Eleanor's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Kill him," she ordered. The men drew their pistols, but Silas was faster. He fired, his shot wild but lucky, hitting one man in the shoulder. The other man fired, the bullet grazing Silas's arm. In the chaos, Eliza broke free. She ran, not towards the house, but deeper into the woods. Silas wanted to follow her, to protect her, but he knew he had to end this. He had to stop his mother. He turned his pistol on Eleanor. She stood her ground, her eyes blazing with fury. "You would shoot your own mother?" she hissed. "You're not my mother," Silas said, his voice steady despite the pain. "You're a monster." He pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the smokehouse. Eleanor Winthrop staggered back, a look of profound shock on her face. She looked down at the dark stain spreading across her silk dress, as if she couldn't believe what had happened. You fool," she gasped, sinking to her knees. "You've ruined everything." She fell forward, her body hitting the dirt floor with a soft thud. She was dead. Silas stood over her, his hand still gripping the pistol. He felt no triumph, only a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. He had killed his mother. He had become the monster she had always accused him of being. He heard the sound of horses approaching. The overseers, alerted by the gunfire, were coming. He knew he couldn't stay. He had to find Eliza. He had to get her to safety. He ran out of the smokehouse, following the trail of broken branches and trampled leaves. He found her by the creek, her body curled up against a tree, her face pale with shock and exhaustion. "Silas," she whispered, her voice weak. He knelt beside her, his own body trembling with pain and adrenaline. "I'm here. I've got you." He helped her to her feet and led her to the horse he had hidden days before. He lifted her onto the saddle and climbed on behind her. "Where to?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "North," he said, his voice firm. "All the way north." They rode through the night, the cold air biting at their skin, the sound of the hounds fading behind them. They were fugitives now, hunted by the law, by the society that had created them. But they were free. As they crossed the state line into Tennessee, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Silas looked down at Eliza, sleeping fitfully against his chest, and placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the faint, steady kick of the life within her. It was a life born of horror, of violence and betrayal. But it was also a life of hope, a life that could be something more. He had lost everything, his home, his name, his family. But in saving Eliza, he had saved a part of his own soul. Magnolia Grove did not survive the death of Eleanor Winthrop. Without her iron will, the plantation fell into chaos. Julian, consumed by guilt and rage, tried to take control, but he was no match for his mother's cunning. The slaves, sensing the weakness in their masters, began to resist. There were whispers of rebellion, of escape. Within a year, the bank foreclosed on the estate. The land was sold off in parcels. The big house fell into ruin, and the slave quarters were abandoned, their timbers slowly being reclaimed by the Georgia woods. The story of the plantation lady who bred slaves with her own sons became a local legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones around campfires. Some said Eleanor's spirit still walked the grounds of Magnolia Grove, her winter blue eyes searching for the daughter-in-law who had escaped her, and the grandchild who carried the cursed Winthrop blood. But the truth was far more powerful than any ghost story. The truth was that Silas and Eliza made it to Ohio, a free state. They changed their names, built a new life, and raised their son, a boy they named Thomas, in freedom. Thomas grew up never knowing the full horror of his origins. He knew his father was a quiet, haunted man who loved books and hated the sight of a whip. He knew his mother was a strong, silent woman who could outwork any man and whose eyes held a deep, unspoken sorrow. But he carried the legacy of Magnolia Grove in his blood, a legacy of both profound evil and a desperate, hard-won redemption. The story of Eleanor Winthrop is a reminder that the greatest horrors are not committed by monsters in the dark, but by ordinary people who choose to look away, who choose profit over humanity, who choose power over love. It is a story that is not just a relic of the past, but a warning for the future. So, listener, as you close this account of Georgia's secret in 1847, remember this. The ghosts of Magnolia Grove are not just in the Georgia pines. They are in the choices we make every day. Will we be complicit in the systems of oppression that surround us? Or will we, like Silas, find the courage to break the chains, even if it means destroying the world we know? The choice is yours, and the ghosts are watching.